On my last episode of Sunday with Stoker, I am so pleased to be joined by one of my good friends in politics, the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs and Cybersecurity, James Paterson. Welcome to the show, James.
Amanda, thank you for having me, but I come with two complaints. Firstly, you will be a great loss here at Sky News. You, I know, have attracted a really dedicated following all around the country, and we will miss you on this platform. I will miss tuning in on Sunday nights. And secondly, of course, I would much prefer you running back again for the federal parliament, not the Queensland state parliament, because you did such an outstanding job as a federal colleague for many years there, and I know you could have slotted straight back into the team. But I do concede Queensland is in need of your services, and I can't wait to see what you do when you get to the state parliament in Queensland with the trust of the people of Adru.
Well, you've embarrassed me enough. Thank you. We saw during COVID how important it is that we have strong and competent state governments to be able to work together with good federal governments. So maybe, you never know, we might get to do good work together in future. Let's move to the big story of the day, James, the horrible conflict that is underway in Israel. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu laid out the stakes clearly. Check this out.
אזרחי ישראל, אנחנו במלחמה, ולהשיב מלחמה שערה בעוצמה ובהיקף שהאויב לא הכיר. האויב ישלם מחיר שהוא לא ידע כמותו. אנחנו במלחמה, ואנחנו ננצח בה.
James, what were your reactions to the footage of what you saw going on in Israel?
Well, Amanda, first of all, I think we would all hope that our national leaders would react with the sense of purpose and decisiveness that Benjamin Netanyahu has shown if our countries were ever to fall before the circumstances that Israel has become. These are the most serious attacks on Israel, at least since the war with Hezbollah in 2006, but arguably at least since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And I think our former colleague and the former ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma, is right when he says that at least psychologically this will have the impact on Israel akin to the 9/11 attacks on the United States. It will utterly shatter the sense of safety and security that Israelis have lived in for the best part of the last decade of relative peace by the standards of the Middle East, where these sorts of attacks just were not able to be conducted against Israel on this scale and were able to be defeated by Iron Dome and other measures. But to see Hamas terrorists streaming in to Israel, breaching the border at several points, abducting hostages and dragging them back into the Gaza Strip for God knows what will happen to them there, was deeply shocking, I think, for everyone to see. And let's be really clear about this. We have seen documented in real time and shared on social media crimes against humanity and war crimes. Innocent civilians, men, women, children, elderly people, have been targeted for assassination and kidnapping. We have seen an ambulance targeted by an armed drone. We have seen the bodies of dead civilians filmed, desecrated and posted on the internet. Each of those things constitutes crimes against international law. And there are people out there in the community who are very concerned about Israel's adherence to international law. I hope they apply that same standard to these reprehensible conduct by Hamas.
Yeah, you're quite right. That documented and very clear bunch of war crimes that's already been made public as a consequence of this needs to be dealt with at least as harshly as those on the sympathetic left would treat Australian soldiers when serving overseas. But more importantly, they shouldn't be giving the soft touch to actions that are coming out of those who identify as Palestinian simply because of that. And it seems like a different standard is often applied when it comes to Israel. What do you think this could mean for the future of the Middle East?
Well, Israel's response will be decisive and devastating, as it should be, because they will never want to ever think that they should have to tolerate this risk again. They cannot allow a militant and armed Hamas to operate on its border with the capability to conduct the attacks that it has. Now, we know that Israel, above almost any nation on earth, is incredibly restrained when it responds to the outrageous provocations of terrorist groups like Hamas. But sadly, we also know that there is likely to be civilian casualties as a result of this. And that is by design in two respects. Firstly, Hamas deliberately co-locates itself and its munitions in civilian areas, including in hospitals and schools. They do that to try and protect those because they know that Israel will be hesitant about targeting them. But secondly, it's actually the intention of Hamas to ensure that there are significant civilian casualties on the Palestinian side, so they can use that as a propaganda weapon against Israel. And it appears very clear that this latest attack is designed, supported by Iran, to prevent the normalisation of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, just as Israel has done through the Abraham Accords with a number of other Middle Eastern countries. They are trying to turn back that wonderful progress towards peace in the region because their interests are not served by peace, their interests are served by terrorism and war, and this just reveals the malign actors for them to be.
And it's a terrible pity that one could have watched the ABC in Australia today all day long and not have got the clarity that you've just provided in the last minute or two. What should be Australia's role here, James?
The most important thing we can do is provide solidarity with Israel. It's very important that we are prompt, that we are vocal, and that we are uncompromising in sending the message that we stand with Israel and we stand with the Jewish community here in Australia, who will not just be afraid about their friends and family in Israel and the danger posed to them, but sadly we know that Jewish people and Jewish holy sites and schools in the past in Australia have come under threat when there has been conflict in Israel and in Palestine. And it's very important that our law enforcement, our intelligence and our security agencies are on high alert, as I'm sure they will be, to protect those Jewish community members here in Australia and their institutions, because we do not want to see any reprisals here against them in Australia. That would be utterly unacceptable. It's also important that we stand with Israel in international forums. We know that Israel is demonised at the United Nations and many other international forums, and we should not stand for that outrageous abuse of those institutions.
Yeah, quite fair. What did you make of Senator Penny Wong's response, which was seeming to call for Israel to not retaliate to what was a clear hostage attack on its civilians? I noticed that, she said Australia unequivocally condemns the attacks on Israel by Hamas, including indiscriminate rocket fire on cities and civilians. We call for these attacks to stop and recognise Israel's right to defend itself. Australia urges the exercise of restraint and protection of civilian lives. That's the end of the quote. But it seems awfully soft. Let's be clear here. Citizens of Israel have been attacked and captured. Israel has every right to defend itself, absolutely, and to use whatever force it needs to protect its people. Is the language that's being used around restraint here a bit of a slap in the face to people who are the victims of this aggression from Hamas?
Amanda, I thought the first two-thirds of Penny Wong's statement were pretty good, but I think the last sentence, particularly in the context in which it was given, while actions by Hamas were still on foot in Israel, while people were being shot at bus stops and in their homes and in restaurants and shopping centres, it came across, frankly, as pretty patronising towards Israel. There is no army on the planet today that can say that it does more than the Israeli Defence Forces to minimise civilian casualties. In fact, when IDF members have been found to exercise their powers outside the law in the past, they have been tried and convicted and jailed in Israel. A very sharp contrast to what happens to Hamas terrorists when they kill civilians. They are lauded and celebrated. They have schools named after them. They have payments made to their families. So there is no moral equivalence here, and no one should pretend that and no one should imply that. And I think that's the unfortunate intent or the unfortunate consequence of what Penny Wong said.
Yeah, I wish more Australians understood the way that terrorists are honoured and celebrated by Hamas in the public institutions of that society. It's not the first time we've had weak statements coming out of Labor about Israel. They've got a powerful pro-Palestinian faction internally. They've described Israeli settlements as illegal under international law and passed motions recognising what they call, quote, occupied Palestinian territories, a nice bit of doublespeak to describe parts of Israel over which Palestine has made claims. Is there a philosophical anti-Israel stance, at least in a large chunk of Labor, that's undermining the robustness of Australia's response on a core matter of principle?
Unfortunately, we know that it is, Amanda. There was a time in this country when support for Israel was strongly bipartisan, and I concede and I acknowledge there are still some very strong supporters of Israel within the Labor caucus and even within the Labor cabinet, and I respect them for fighting very hard for that cause in difficult circumstances. But we can all recognise that the Labor Party is continuing to drift away from Israel. They've demonstrated that in just recent months by using really inappropriate language to describe what are disputed territories between future states of Palestine and Israel, that by calling them occupied Palestinian territories, prejudging what constitutes modern Israel and what will constitute a Palestinian state if peace is ever be able to achieve, and including in that East Jerusalem and significant holy sites to the Jewish people, including the Western Wall. Really absurd language. We saw them reverse the former government's recognition of Jerusalem, a decision that they made without consulting the Jewish community here in Australia or the Israeli government, and one which they announced on a Jewish holiday, a really appalling mistreatment of our Jewish community here in Australia and our friend in Israel. And sadly, I think those within the Labor Party who are anti-Israel are growing in strength, and they have at the figurehead of the government in a Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, someone who has said appallingly biased and unreasonable and unfair things about Israel in the past. Now, he's been more quiet about those views since he became leader of the party and Prime Minister, but I fear that that underlies some of the hostility from the Labor Party to Israel.
James Patterson, thank you very much for your reflections tonight.